He was not only a great sportsman, beside and rugged outdoor type. He loved all kinds of adventures, like safaris in Africa. And at one point, he was actually in two plane crashes that he survived, but the consequences were serious injuries that plagued him for the rest of his life, and the pain was unbearable. That was in Africa. Then he had another plane crash. The guy has more lives than a cat. He survived that one, but I think all of the pain, physical pain, that he had to suffer the rest of his life led to, of course, the use of painkillers and so on and so forth. And then in 1961, I guess it was too much, he committed suicide in the home he was living in Ohio, in Idaho. So Ernest Hemingway was a novelist, American novelist, short story writer, a journalist. It's very important that he began his career as a journalist, because the journalistic style of writing that's typical for that profession, he introduced to not writing novels like the one we're going to read. And that changed the whole style of writing in modern American literature. I'll talk more about it when we get to it. His influence on 20th century fiction was incredible. And he produced most of his work between the mid-1920s and the mid-1950s. And he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954. He published 7 novels, 6 short story collections, 2 nonfiction works. And in addition, he wrote other novels and short stories and works that were published posthumously after his death. He was raised, Hemingway, was raised in Oak Park, Illinois. After high school, he was a reporter for a few months for the Kansas City Star newspaper, before leaving for the Italian front to enlist with the World War I ambulance drivers. We'll talk a bit about that. This whole voluntary ambulance corps in World War I obviously is reflected in the story, because the main character, Lieutenant Henry, is an ambulance driver, an American ambulance driver in Italy. In 1918, he was seriously wounded and he returned home during the war. And his wartime experiences formed the basis for this novel, A Farewell to Arms, which was published in 1929. In 1921, he married Hadley Richardson. This is the first of his 4 marriages. He's married 4 times. He must have really enjoyed it. But actually what happened was, while he was in Italy, he fell in love before he'd ever married, and with the nurse he met. So also sort of echoes in this novel. And they were going to get married after the war ended and come to America. But a few months later, he got a letter from her, and the letter indicated she met someone else and she's marrying him. I think, and most of his biographers agree, that's probably why he had so many marriages. He was afraid of being rejected, so as a defense, he did the rejecting first. He, when he thought things were not going well, he left the marriage rather than be the one who was the victim. Right? So that might explain all of his different marriages. In the 1920s, he went to live in Paris, and he was part of that group known as the Lost Generation. I know what they meant. I probably mentioned already in this class, but if I didn't, what was the Lost Generation? There were a bunch of expatriate Americans, young people, writers, and other artistic types, who left America and settled in Paris. And it was an amazing collection of some of the brightest and most creative minds that America had to offer. Leading that group was a woman named Gertrude Stein, poet, writer. She's the one who coined the phrase, the Lost Generation. Lost Generation referred to that generation after World War I, because the young men who served in World War I mentioned this the last time, sort of lost a big chunk of that part of life where you prepare professionally in terms of marriage and family and so on, but they were on the battlefield and they missed that. So there's a big gap in their development going forward, not to mention the trauma they suffered if they survived or the physical injuries that they had to deal with. So they were this lost generation. And he became part of that group, very much influenced by Gertrude Stein and others, Ezra Pound, very important British writer, and John Dos Passos, an American writer who wrote some really interesting World War I novels, but haven't got time for all of that. Then he was also a journalist, and he served in that capacity during the Spanish Civil War. And that led to the novel he wrote called For Whom the Bell Tolls, 1940. In 1952, he wrote his famous novel. Usually you read this in high school, The Old Man of the Sea, because at that point, Hemingway had settled down in Key West, Florida, and in Cuba. He had homes in Key West and in Cuba. It's before the Castro Revolution, and that was the catalyst for writing that a really great little novel, The Old Man of the Sea. Then he settled into Ketchum, Idaho, bought a home in Idaho, and that's where, unfortunately, in 1961, he committed suicide. He was born into, an upper middle class family. His father was a physician. His mother was a musician, a pianist, and encouraged him, despite his reluctance, to learn to play the cello or something. He hated her for it. She was a very culturally involved woman, very demanding, and he basically said he hates his mother. But he did admit that the forced music lessons actually developed his style as a writer. If you know anything about Baroque music and the notion of the counterpoint, of contrapuntal music, that is a very important element in some of his later novels. So he does, admit at some point or acknowledge that, his mother's forced music lessons did have some benefit in terms of his writing, but it was, cello lessons. But he was not very fond of her. And in fact, when he came back from the First World War, he realized there's no way he could live with his parents. First, he was too independent at that point, and they were too stifling. So he had to get away, and he did. He became a journalist in Chicago, Illinois, and then Kansas City, and so on. He did receive a silver medal for bravery when he was involved in the ambulance corps, because he was injured by some shrapnel. But notwithstanding the injury, he managed to save the lives of some of the other Italian men that were working with him. After that, he received this medal, silver medal for bravery. He, as I said, had 4 marriages, none of them particularly successful. But there were a number of children that came out of the marriage, especially the first marriage. And he was sort of the iconic American figure, tall, sturdy, good-looking sportsman. Guy went out on safari and all kinds of various adventures and so on. But interestingly, in terms of this novel, he portrays a very different kind of a person and a very different kind of a novelistic writing, especially when it comes to war. War was always something that was glorified in literature. You can think of Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage and others, Charge the Light Brigade and Lord Tennyson. He does not portray war at all as something ennobling or something positive, something that builds character, something that develops, your manliness. Quite the contrary. You'll see the main character here, Lieutenant Henry. I mean, he is an aloof, cold person, and in some ways never really gets beyond that, even in his relationship with Catherine. But he portrays war itself as something less than honorable, or something less than undertaking to praise and to exalt or whatever. Unlike what we're going to read in Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel, where in typically German fashion, war is the ultimate experience. Just one last point before I show you this brief introduction to Hemingway. The American Ambulance Field Service, it came around 1916. What happened was there was a retired Harvard professor. His name was Abram Platt Andrew. And he decided to join the American hospital. There was an American hospital in Italy, to join the ambulance corps together with Italians. The Italians were on the Allied side of World War I. And so he left and joined this ambulance corps, ambulance service, and encouraged others to do the same. And Hemingway, I guess in part for this yet another adventure, joined the American Ambulance Field Service. And that's the setting for this novel. This guy, Abram Platt Andrew, later on became a congressman, actually from Massachusetts. But he was the one who really encouraged Americans to join the war effort in World War I as volunteer ambulance drivers on the front, specifically the Italian front in the war. So now I want to show you our friend Indy. I know his last name now. We've seen a few of his pieces on World War I, and he actually has this short introduction to A Farewell to Arms.
He is regarded, and with good reason, as one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. But before that, years before his fame, he was an ambulance driver on the Italian front in the Great War, Ernest Hemingway. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War bio special about Ernest Hemingway and the First World War. Ernest Miller Hemingway was born July 21st, 1899 in Oak Park, a well-to-do suburb of Chicago. He graduated high school in June 1917, but did not go to university, taking a job instead with the Kansas City Star newspaper. He only worked there for a few months, but would use the paper's style guide as a foundation for his later writing. Use short sentences. Use short first paragraphs. Use vigorous English. Be positive, not negative. The U.S. had just joined the war at that point, and young Ernest was eager to serve. He aspired to join the Marines, but was rejected because he was too nearsighted. He did join the National Guard that fall, but when representatives of the Italian Red Cross came to Kansas City recruiting ambulance drivers, he falsified his birth certificate to make himself a year older, memorized the eye chart, and joined up, arriving in Paris May 1918, and then in Italy the following month. His first experience there was treating victims of a munitions factory explosion near Milan, which he would write about for The Star, as well as later in his nonfiction book, Death in the Afternoon. Now, he left Milan for Schio June 9th, which was near the Italian front line in the Veneto region, on the Pasubio sector of the front. He and his crew stayed in a mill where they slept on a row of cots, and he was frustrated that he was not allowed up to the front lines and the action. Still, Schio was awash with taverns, and Ernest began his practice of hanging around the taverns with the Italian soldiers and hearing color and detail about the war that would later turn up in his novels and stories. He would also spend a lot of time reading Italian trench newspapers once he learned Italian, which he did over the summer. There were other American drivers there, including novelist John Dos Passos, but many of them, especially those who'd served in France, did not very much like Hemingway, considering him a young hothead, spoiling for a fight. The Italian ambulance drivers looked down on the American drivers in general as impulsive children who would endanger them. In mid-June 1918, the Austrian army launched the Second Battle of the Piave River, also known as the Battle of the Solstice. They attacked towards Monte Grappa in the mountains and along the lower Piave River. By the 20th, though, the Austrians were in full retreat, but the fighting had been fierce, and extra Red Cross help was called in to assist the 38 ambulances already there. Around June 25th, though possibly July 1st, Hemingway and the other American drivers arrived from Schio in Fiat ambulances. He was billeted near where the Piave empties into the Venetian Lagoon, a marshy area home to dysentery and malaria. There he went out on a bicycle borrowed from the Bersaglieri, bringing news from position to position and delivering small comforts like cigarettes to the Italian soldiers, by whom he was well liked. This could actually be quite dangerous, for though fighting had slowed, there was still sniping in the region, and a predecessor of his had been killed by a grenade. He soon became friends with an Italian officer, Lieutenant Eduardo Lanzetti, and the priest Don Menozzi. These two ran the Casa del Soldado, the Soldiers' Home, a Catholic recreational organization that provided things like showers, writing materials, literary classes, and stuff like that. Hemingway worked with them, and they would be the models for several characters in his books. The other Americans returned to Schio, but Hemingway managed to remain behind and took to wearing a Bersaglieri uniform. He was wounded July 7th. The day before, the Italians had destroyed an Austrian bridgehead, and the Austrians responded by beginning to throw grenades at targets that had previously been off limits, like medical posts. On the 7th, amid rumors of an impending Italian attack, Hemingway went out to a machine gun listening post along the river. The Italian bombardment began at midnight, and a blast from a mortar shell arrived and knocked Hemingway flat. Then there was a flash, as when a blast furnace door is swung open, and a roar that started white and went red, on and on in a rushing wind. My breath could not come, and I felt myself rush bodily out of myself, and out, and out, and out, all the time bodily in the wind. I went swiftly, all of myself, and I knew I was dead. Then I floated, and instead of going on and on, I felt myself slide back. I breathed, and I was back. The blast tore the legs off a man near him. Another man had shrapnel in his chest. Hemingway carried him for 40 meters before being hit by machine gun fire in his left thigh and falling. He got up and carried the man another 50 meters before being hit again and fainting. He lay in shock for 2 hours before he was taken to a dressing station. Eventually, he was found by an American who got him to an operating table. There, a doctor removed 227 pieces of shrapnel from him, mostly from his legs. He was then taken to a temporary hospital in an elementary school where a priest baptized him and gave him last rites, but he did not, of course, die. He would be awarded the Silver Medal of Honor and the Italian War Cross for his actions that day. On July 15th, he was transferred to Milano, arriving the 17th, where he would stay in a Red Cross hospital. His experiences there would be central to A Farewell to Arms, his first bestseller, which would be published in 1929. The character of Catherine Barclay was inspired by the nurse Agnes von Kurowski, who took care of Hemingway and with whom he fell in love. She was 26. He would turn 19 a few days after arriving in Milano. And though the bottles of Chianti, cognac, and Cinzano he smuggled into the hospital were real enough, the sex part was the fruit of his imagination. He also had a rival for her affections, one of the Arditi, who became the basis for the character Rinaldo Rinaldi. Operated on again in August, he remained in Milano for physiotherapy. In October, he went back to Schio, hoping to rejoin the action as the Battle of Vittorio Veneto heated up. However, he contracted dysentery and was sent back to Milano. He had plans to marry von Kurowski, and after the armistice, went to see her in Treviso before returning to the States. Like many others, he had trouble adjusting to civilian life, even though he was a local celebrity and made speeches at schools and clubs around Oak Park. In March 1919, after dropping several hints, Agnes von Kurowski wrote him a letter telling him she was leaving him and marrying a Neapolitan duke. She never actually did that. Hemingway was devastated, though he married Hadley Richardson 2 years later. Also in 1921, former Italian Army Chief of Staff Armando Diaz came to Chicago and awarded Hemingway the War Cross. In 1922, Hemingway returned to Europe as a correspondent for the Toronto Star, covering the Greco-Turkish War and all that followed. Paris in the 20s, bullfights, F. Scott Fitzgerald, world fame, and a Nobel Prize. Well, that's history. The war and his experiences would turn up frequently in his writing, often even depictions of things he heard about secondhand but was not there for firsthand, like Gorizia, which he described, though he never went there, or the Caporetto retreat in A Farewell to Arms. He is considered by many to be a war writer, and death in images and themes is prevalent, even as his stories were rich with identifiable details. He would be involved with the Spanish Civil War and World War II, and committed suicide in 1961. But that is beyond the scope of this channel. You are encouraged to not only look that up for yourself, but to read his stories, as they are some of the most influential and good books of the 20th century, and many were heavily influenced by his brief service in the Great War. Thank you, Madeline Johnson, for the research for this episode. If you
Okay, good introduction. By the way, not to overemphasize this fact, and he alludes to it, Hemingway, again, began as a journalist, and journalists have a very specific style of writing. When you read a newspaper, the sentences are very short and to the point, unlike the very flowery and convoluted language you find sometimes in novels. And that journalistic influence is what you'll see in Farewell to Arms, but that had a phenomenal impact on writing in general, because before Hemingway adopted that style, very short, concise, telegraphic, if you read a novel, the sentences went on forever, and they were heavily overburdened with all kinds of description, whatever. No, he was like to the point, concise, short, and but active. And he said, positive, not negative. Positive in the sense that he uses a lot of verbs that are very powerful and striking and descriptive. And in that sense, rather than sort of meandering and using sort of mealy-mouthed language or whatever, he was, a real man's man, as they say, and it shows up in his writing as well. So this novel, Farewell to Arms, is the great American World War I novel. He mentioned the friendship with John Dos Passos, who also wrote a number of novels, also great writer, also dealing with World War I. But generally speaking, when it comes to World War I, we're going to be looking at a lot of poetry. Almost all those poems came from the pen of British writers. The British writers seem to be more comfortable or whatever, felt more that they could be more expressive using poetry rather than, full-length prose writing. Americans were never, I should say never big on poetry. There's some great American poets, but in terms of World War I writing, the most famous and enduring pieces of writing are the novels and the short stories. And this one is the American, really, World War I novel, just like in Germany, we're going to read All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque, and that's the quintessential German World War I novel. So what is this story all about? It basically revolves around two people, Lieutenant Henry and Catherine Barclay, a nurse. And as he pointed out, most all of the incidents and episodes in this novel reflect, one way or another, the experiences that Hemingway himself had in World War I. And so World War I is not only the backdrop for this romance, the war and the romance are tied together. They're sort of woven together. And what's happening outside, in the world beyond, is also in many ways reflected internally in the relationship between these two people. But on the other hand, the horrors of World War I are muted in a sense that the two of them try and create their own world, try and create their own peaceful atmosphere separate and apart from the war that's going on. And you'll see there are many ways that escapism is portrayed in this novel. But the truth is that they cannot totally separate themselves from the reality of the war. And the war is in many ways a reflection or a symbol for the nature of this relationship and how it's going to end. And it's going to have well, I don't know whether you read the whole thing yet, but it's going to rather a tragic ending. But the tragic ending in many ways mirrors the tragedy of that war and maybe war in general. So this is a piece of literature. It's not history. It's historic fiction. Now, in the other half of my academic life, I teach comparative literature at Baruch College. So now, in a sense, we're going to switch or segue from history, historical writing, to literature. And literature uses certain conventions, right? I hope along the way, become familiar with what a metaphor is and a simile, how symbolism works in literature. And there's a lot of that in this story. And especially in the very first chapter, a lot of the symbolism or metaphorical usage is going to reflect the war that's in the background, but also it's going to foreshadow the end of the story and the end of this relationship between these two people. So who are the main characters? Who are the characters here that we have to focus on? Well, there's Frederick Henry, right? Henry is in many ways the alter ego of Ernest Hemingway. It's clearly, there's clearly autobiography in here. So this guy, Henry, how does he portray himself? He basically portrays himself as a man of duty. He has no sense of honor, and he doesn't expect praise. In other words, he's there to fulfill a duty, an obligation, that is as an ambulance driver, and that's what he does. There's no sense of bravery. There's no sense of acting in an extraordinary manner under fire or whatever. And he doesn't expect any kind of praise or any recognition for what he does. That already suggests a very different kind of war novel. As I said earlier, usually, or until now, when war was portrayed in literature, you can think of Lord Tennyson, the Charge of the Light Brigade, or the Civil War novel by Stephen Crane, Red Badge of Courage. That's just two examples, but they represent, the vast majority of writing dealing with war. War is a very positive event in the sense that it builds character and it produces heroes. And there's always unending acts of bravery, not for Lieutenant Henry, not for Hemingway. It's just a matter of doing what you've been sent over to do. And so it's a very different kind of a novel. And I would say that not quite as much as All Quiet on the Western Front, but to a certain extent, this is also in some ways an anti-war novel. It takes the bluster out of war. All of the heroism and the bravery and the acts of superhuman valor, it's not there. It's not there. So he is, in fact, he discourages any recognition of what he's done. There's this other character, Rinaldi, he's the doctor. I mean, he's a competent doctor. He's a vile, despicable, good-natured guy. He's a unbearable womanizer. And he frequents local brothels all the time. And all he does is, all women mean to him, sexual conquest or whatever. And there's a suggestion that he's ill, and the illness that suggests it's probably his syphilis. I mean, if you go running around to brothels all over the place, it's not all that unlikely that they'll contract a venereal disease, and that's nothing to clap about. Well, it's a joke. Anyway, so Rinaldi is this despicable, womanizing, skirt-chasing doctor who wants to encourage Henry to get all these awards for what he's done, and Henry has no interest in that. And then the third part of this triangle is Catherine Barclay. Catherine Barclay, you have to remember, this is written in 1929. Things change, attitudes change, and feminists or feminist critics of literature find her a despicable figure because she's everything that a feminist would reject. She's submissive. She is putty in the hands, really, of Lieutenant Henry, and she's, she said at one point, not to kill the punchlines and everything, because you probably haven't read that far, but she becomes pregnant, and for her, that's ultimate fulfillment: to be a wife and a mother, and to live in the house behind the white picket fence and the whole thing. It's 1929. You have to read. History for now. You have to read history in terms of the context, the time in which it was written, and what the attitudes were. You can't superimpose, current notions, or current attitudes, or current, ideologies onto a different period in time. You have to see them within the context of the time they were written. So too, in 1929, Catherine Barclay would not be anything out of the ordinary. You can argue from the perspective of the 21st century, this is not desirable or the ultimate, role that women should seek, but that's looking backwards. You have to look at it in terms of the time in which this was written. So she gets really clobbered from modern feminist critics of literature because she's everything that they find unacceptable. She's easily seduced. She basically plays up to Lieutenant Henry in a submissive way, and so on. But again, you have to toss out for the time being your current modern contemporary views of feminism and look at it in terms of the time in which it was written and what the point and the symbolism of this woman is. You can critique it. You can say from our contemporary attitude today, she's not exactly the model of a woman that we strive to be, but you have to put that aside. And so what do they together represent in terms of this novel set in the middle of a world war? So those are the three main characters here. There are other secondary characters along the way, but the story really, in a sense, revolves around them, and more specifically around Catherine Barclay, the nurse, and Lieutenant Frederick Henry, the ambulance driver. So now looking at the first chapter, which is full of symbolism and metaphors and all kinds of allusions. In the late summer of that year, we lived in a house in a village that looked across the river and the plain to the mountains. In the bed of the river, there were pebbles and boulders, dry white in the sun, and water was clear and swiftly moving and blue in the channels. Very nice image of the landscape, right? But now look at the next lines. Soldiers. Troops went by the house and down the road, and the dust they raised powdered the leaves of the trees. The trunks of the trees, too, were dusty, and the leaves fell early that year. And we saw the troops marching along the road, and the dust rising, and leaves stirred by the breeze falling, and soldiers marching, and afterward the road bare and white except for the leaves. See, the soldiers marching down the road as it's the summer. Everything's dry. As they're marching down the road, they're kicking up the dust. And the dust, the white dust, is covering everything. So what does that suggest? The soldiers marching, kicking up the dust covering everything, the white dust covering everything suggests a shroud. Right? Shroud is the white garment on the dead body before it's buried. And so there's already an image of death, and it's connected to the soldiers, because soldiers are harbingers of death, right? Because war inevitably brings a lot of death. So the whole landscape is sort of shrouded in this dust that is kicked up by the boots of the soldiers marching by. The plain was rich with crops. There were many orchards of fruit trees, and beyond the plain, the mountains were brown and bare. Again, interesting contrast. It's the summer. The fruit trees are laden with ripe fruit and so on. Many orchards of these fruit trees, but beyond that, the mountains were brown and bare, the exact opposite image. The fruitfulness, the life force of the orchards is, however, contrasted with the barrenness, the bareness, the brownness of the mountains in the distance. And in those mountains, there was fighting and the flashing of artillery, right? So fighting and artillery are the antithesis of fruit-laden trees. Fighting and artillery destroys everything. It's death-giving, not life-giving. And the contrast between life-giving and death-giving, or life-taking, is the most important theme that's going to run through this novel. If you look at the next page, second page of the first chapter, maybe 10 lines down, the vineyards were thin and bare branched too, and all the country wet and brown and dead with autumn. Right? Autumn, of course, follows the summer. It follows the green, verdant summer and all the fruit and everything else. So he's transitioning into a sort of death-like time. Right? I just, in my comp lit class at Baruch, we read John Keats' poem, Autumn. I don't know that any of you are familiar with it. It's the most beautiful poem I think I've ever read. And Keats describes the mellow beauty of autumn and the gourd, plump to the plump gourd, right? The pumpkins and the other gourds are fully grown, they're fat and they're ready to explode, and they're filled with seeds, and which is an allusion to further generations of these gourds, right? Because the winter is followed by the summer, this autumn is followed by the winter, and winter is usually associated with death, right? That's the time of year nothing grows, right? It's all brown and dead. But the seeds and the pits and so on inside these swollen gourds and fruits and so on, they're the promise of another generation of them, right? And basically what Keats is saying is the 4 seasons of the year correspond to the 4 seasons of a person's life. You're born, that's spring. Everything emerges, new, right? Summer, you mature. The earth matures. Summer, all of the fruit and all the vegetation. And then in autumn, things start turning the other direction, right? And everything that's fully ripened is harvested, and the grain is cut, and the wheat is cut, so all that's left is stubble. And then, of course, comes winter, when there's no growth and no fruitfulness, whatever. But in Keats' poem, it has a very positive image, because it says, look, you know what? Autumn has its own beauty, has its own song, just like spring, different song, but it's a mellow. Autumn is very mellow. It's not all the bright colors that you find in the spring, all the flowers and everything. It's the muted, mellow colors, so the burnt oranges and the sort of muted reds and so on. But it's its own separate beauty because it's a period of maturity. And correspondingly, he says, in human life, autumn, which is the time of maturity, it's the last season before it's all over, in the winter, but it has its own mellowness, its own reflection, time to reflect. So here again, you have the contrast of the seasons, but because of the war that's going on and the trampling of the troops and everything, it's suggesting death as they're moving into winter, right? Moving into that season that is not full of growth and vegetation and fruitfulness and so on. And then a really moving description, and it's a very important foreshadowing of what's going to happen in the story. There were mists over the river and the clouds on the mountain, and the trucks splashed mud on the road, and the troops were muddy and wet in their capes. Right? It's capes, part of the Italian uniform. Their rifles were wet, and under their capes, the 2 leather cartridge boxes on the front of the belts. Gray leather boxes heavy with the packs of clips of thin, long 6.5 millimeter cartridges, bullets, bulged forward under the capes so that the men passing on the road marched as though they were 6 months gone with child. This is probably the most important image and foreshadowing of the whole story. What is he describing? They're soldiers, they're marching along. They're wearing capes. In the Italian uniform, army, they had a cape that went over the uniform. Under the cape, there were cartridge boxes. And the capes covered the cartridge box. So the soldiers looked as though they were 6 months pregnant because they were protruding under the cape. What's the message here? What's the image? Birth is life-giving, right? The ultimate conclusion or the ultimate end of the 9 months of pregnancy is the birth of a child, right? So when you see a pregnant woman, it's a positive, very wholesome, fruitful image, because ultimately that is going to give way to the appearance of another human being, of a child born. But what about the image he's describing here? He's comparing it to being pregnant, because the soldiers look like they have, 6 months of pregnancy in front of them under the cape. But what they have under the cape is not a birth that's imminent, it's death that's imminent, because it's a box of cartridges that they're going to be using in their rifles to shoot at the enemy. So keep that in mind, because in the course of the story, I already sort of alluded to it, Catherine Barkley, the nurse, has become pregnant. And up to a point, it's a very vital and a very positive image, especially set against the war that's going on outside, right? War is death. Pregnancy is life. But it's not how it's going to turn out at the end. The child she's carrying is unfortunately not going to be a viable infant. It's going to be a stillbirth. The child's not going to be born alive. And so that ties the war on the outside that she and Henry, Lieutenant Henry, are trying to make believe doesn't exist by creating their own world. You can't. You can run, but you can't hide, right? You can't escape it. And symbolically, the image in the beginning is going to be tied to the event at the end. And in the course of a war like this, with so much death and destruction, it's going to be mirrored or reflected in the lives of these two people, because even their own attempt at producing a child is going to fail. Because even though they try and create their own fantasy land and make believe the war isn't ongoing, and they are planning their future together after the war, you can't make believe it isn't there. And it comes home to roost at the very end, in the last scene in the hospital, when she's in the maternity ward, about to give birth. So that's the way the story is introduced. Very, very powerful introductory first chapter. Right, and then it goes on to the second. The next year, there were many victories. The mountains that were behind the valley and the hillside where the chestnut forest grew was captured, and there were victories here and there. And he talks about Gorizia, and as that introduction mentioned, he speaks about this battle of Gorizia in Italy, but he was never there. But he still brings it into the novel. And then he mentions a few lines later, the river ran behind us. The town had been captured very handsomely, but the mountains beyond it could not be taken. I was very glad the Austrians seemed to want to come back to the town sometime if the war should end, because they did not bombard it to destroy it, but only a little in a military way. The battle, by the way, he mentions it, and it's a whole separate part of the Western Front. But the Italians, who again were with the Allies, were fighting the Austro-Hungarians, who were allied with the Germans in World War I. And a lot of the battles on that Western Front were between Italy and Austria. The Austrians had a decided benefit. And even though the Italians managed to have some victories here and there, they were brutalized. Why? As they say in the real estate business, location, location, location. The Austrian army had the benefit of being on the heights in Tyrol, the Austrian Alps. So they were high up. The Italians were down below. You get the picture, right? A lot easier and a lot better to be situated above shooting down than being down shooting up. So for a while, the Austrians were just wiping away the Italian army. It just kept firing down, and there was not much the Italians could do. And then he describes this town. People lived on it, and there were hospitals and cafes and artillery up side streets, and two bawdy houses, one for troops and one for officers. What are bawdy houses? Right? The bordellos, right? And so there were two. The officers got the better bawdy house, and I guess the more desirable prostitutes, and the troops sort of had, were given what they were given, right? But again, this has metaphoric, symbolic significance in terms of the story too, because the priest who shows up soon in the story is chastising these men for visiting these houses of ill repute. But again, it ties to the theme, because we know what goes on in a house of ill repute, right, in a bordello. But the contrast is that the sex act that takes place in these places, is not there for the purpose of producing life. Right? The acts that take place in bordellos are strictly for the pleasure and the satisfaction of the pleasure principle, as Freud would call it, of these soldiers and these generals, whatever. It's not there for. They're not asked to produce life. They're not between husband and wife. They're not life-giving, right? So again, it's an image of self-gratification, but not with the intent of producing further life. And we're in the middle of a war, and life-giving is not consistent with what's going on out there in the battlefield. It's all life-taking. And in the case of Rinaldi, the doctor, it's totally for his own pleasurable, pursuits and so on and so forth. No sense of connection or commitments to anyone else. It's totally self-directed. Okay, if you look at the next page, the forest of oak trees on the mountain beyond the town was gone, right? Because all of the shrapnel and everything is flying. It's cutting down all the trees. The forest had been green in the summer when it had come into we had come into the town, but now there were the stumps and the broken trunks and the ground torn up. And one day at the end of the fall, when I was out where the oak forest had been, I saw a cloud coming over the mountain. So the war brought in the soldiers destroyed the trees and the forest all around. All that were left were stumps and broken trunks, which is sort of parallel or suggestive of the condition of the soldiers, many of them who were left with missing body parts and missing limbs and so on and so forth. It came very fast and the sun went to dull yellow and then everything was gray and the sky was covered and the cloud came on down the mountain and suddenly we're in it and it was snow. Obviously, they're going to the higher elevations. But what does snow do? It covers everything like a shroud. The snow slanted across the wind, and the bare ground was covered, and the stumps of trees projected. There was snow on the guns and snow everywhere. This reminds one of a very, very famous novel that actually was published virtually the same time as Farewell to Arms. Has anyone ever read James Joyce, Ulysses? Oh, I'm sorry, it's not in Ulysses. It's in his short story, The Dead. Sorry, it's in a collection called The Dubliners, and it's the story called The Dead. And it has one of the most famous endings in all of modern literature. It involves a guy by the name of Gabriel Conroy. Gabriel Conroy is an English professor, and he totally is immersed in literature, somehow detached from life. And it's an evening event around the Christmas season, actually the feast of the Epiphany. Because an epiphany is a sudden, realization or a moment when the light goes on. And that's what happens at this annual dinner party that his aunts give. And he's there with his wife, and I don't know the whole story, but basically what happens is he realizes that his wife still had in her mind the image of a young man that she was dating way back when they were teenagers, who died very young of some pulmonary disease or other. And all of a sudden at the end of the evening, one of the guests is a tenor, singer, and he starts singing a particular Irish song, and she associates that song with this young man, Michael Fury, who had died so young. And he realizes Gabriel, her husband, what's going on here? You're totally lost. He said, yeah, that song, it brings back the memory of this young man, Michael Fury, from my youth, and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, he has this epiphany. He has this sudden, breakthrough and realizes, I'm married to this woman all these years. We have all these kids, and 2 kids, actually, 1 boy, 1 girl. And all this time, she hasn't given up the memory of the experience with this young man when she was a teenager. And you know what? This young man must be the example of true love. He sacrificed his life. He was not a well young man. And the night that before Gabriel's wife was leaving to go back to Dublin, he had to see her one more time. He couldn't go without seeing her. And so that night, it was pouring rain. He came out in the pouring rain, tossed a pebble up against the window of her bedroom so she would come out and he could say goodbye to her. And basically, she said, he killed himself for me. The guy was already suffering from all kinds of pulmonary problems and whatever. He was a very sensitive and a very weak or sickly young man. And sure enough, a couple of weeks later, he died. And so Gabriel, her husband, said, wow, I guess that's love, right? The guy only knew what love was from the novels he taught, but now it's real life. And the story ends, this long digression, the story ends, he's looking out the window and it's snowing. And the famous line, the snow was falling gently and gently falling over all the living and the dead, right? And that's what this line sounds like. As he describes now the snow falling in the heights and the mountains, it almost mirrors the same language of James Joyce. But the point being that the snow is another shroud covering the living and the dead, right? Just like in James Joyce, it was falling slowly and heavily and so on. It really sounds very much like an allusion to James Joyce, right? And now he's in leaving this bawdy house, this whatever, and the priest comes by. The priest looked up, he saw us, and he smiled. My friend motioned for him to come in. The priest shook his head and went on. That, obviously, is a priest, not going in there. That night in the mess, after the spaghetti course, which everyone ate very quickly and seriously, lifting the spaghetti on the fork until the loose strands hung clear, then lowered them into their mouth. And if you're into Freudian interpretation of these things, you can see what the Freudian interpretation is. But then there's the priest on the next page. The priest was young and blushed easily and wore a uniform like the rest of us with a cross and dark red velvet above the left breast pocket of his gray tunic. And so the captain, that's what's his name, Henry, is sort of making fun, fooling around with the priest. Priest today with girls, the captain said, looking at the priest. The priest smiled and blushed. Not true, asked the captain. Today I see priest with girls. No, said the priest. And everyone's sort of baiting him and having fun with the priest. But again, what is this symbolism here? He's a priest. Priests are celibate. He isn't getting married. He isn't having those relationships. He isn't producing children, right? So again, it's this image and the symbol of life that is not a life force, that is not giving forth more life, right? It's the priest. And all of these symbols, all these metaphors, all these allusions are reinforcing the fact that war takes young men in the prime of their lives who would be naturally getting married, having families, producing more children, but no, they're either in these bawdy houses, finding physical pleasure, but not, it's not there to reproduce. And they're going to end up, most of them, dead on the battlefield. And it's young life snuffed out. And no future generations coming from these soldiers. So it's a repeating sort of a motif of death and cutting off and ending life rather than the opposite, because that's what war is. War isn't life producing, right? It's quite the contrary. So there are all of these different allusions to that in the course of the novel, but of course the big symbol and the big metaphor is what's going to happen with Frederick Henry and Catherine Barclay. Let's look at the next chapter, chapter 3. You probably have a different edition of it, so it's page 16 in mine, but it's chapter 3. The chapters are very, very short, 2 to 3 pages each. When I came back to the front, we still lived in that town, and there were many more guns in the country around, and spring had come. The fields were green, and there were small green shoots on the vines, and the trees along the road had small leaves, and a breeze came from the sea. I saw the town with the hill and the old castle above it, and a cup in the hills with the mountains beyond, brown mountains with little green on their slopes. In the town, there were more guns. There were some new hospitals. You met British men and sometimes women on the street, and a few more houses had been hit by shell fire. Okay, this is sort of the introduction to the very important British figure. That is Catherine Barclay, the nurse, who's British. And then on the next page, we're introduced to Lieutenant Rinaldi. Rinaldi is a doctor in the Italian army, but I said a real womanizer and a really despicable human being. The room I shared with Lieutenant Rinaldi looked out on the courtyard. The window was open, my bed was made up with blankets, and my things hung on the wall. The gas mask in an oblong tin can, the steel helmet on the same peg, right? So that's clearly tying the essence of this war to the events, but again, symbolically, the gas mask is just hanging on the wall on a peg with a helmet, two very, very strong and striking images of World War I. And of course, the gas mask is to protect the soldier from the incoming poison gas, which is poison gas. It's killing, right? It's chemical killing. And the helmet is to protect the soldier from the incoming projectiles and shrapnel and everything else. Then he goes on. At the floor of the bed with my flat trunk, my winter boots, the leather shiny with oil, were on the trunk. My Austrian sniper's rifle with its blued octagon barrel and the lovely dark walnut cheek-fitted Schützenstock hung over the two beds, right? Why does he have an Austrian sniper's rifle? It's probably something he picked up as a souvenir of the opposing army, the Austrian army. The telescope that fitted it was, I remembered, locked in the trunk. The Lieutenant Rinaldi lay asleep on the other bed. He woke when he heard me in the room and he sat up. Ciao, he said. What kind of time did you have? Magnificent. We shook hands and he put his arm around my neck and kissed me. Oh, I said. You're dirty, he said. You ought to wash. Where did you go and what did you do? Tell me. Well, I went everywhere. I went to Milano, to Florence, Rome, Naples, Villa San Giovanni, Messina, Taormina. You talk like a timetable. Did you have any beautiful adventures? For Rinaldi, beautiful adventures means beautiful women. Right? Yes, where? Milano, Firenze, Florence, Roma, Napoli. That's enough. Tell me, really, what was the best in Milano? That was because it was first. Where did you meet her? In the Cova? Where did you go? How did you feel? Tell me everything. Yes, that's nothing. Here now we have beautiful girls, new girls, never been to the front before, right? Whole new, this is Rinaldi speaking, a whole new flock of young women to chase. Yes, that's nothing. Here we have beautiful girls, new girls, and so on. Wonderful. You don't believe me? We will go now this afternoon and see. And in the town, we have beautiful English girls. I am now in love with Miss Barclay. I will take you to call. I will probably marry Miss Barclay. That's Rinaldi, the doctor, speaking. He isn't marrying anybody. He's only interested in the quest and in the conquest. But he said, yeah, I'm in love with her. He's not in love with anybody but himself. I'm in love means for him, I'm in lust. I desire her. Okay, I have to get washed and so on and so forth. On the next page. Since you're gone, we have nothing but frostbites. This is the doctor speaking. Frostbites, chilblains, jaundice, gonorrhea, self-inflicted wounds, pneumonia, and hard and soft chancres. What is that all about? Okay, frostbite. Yeah, it's the winter, it's cold, they're up in the mountains, and frostbite is not an uncommon affliction in a winter war. Gonorrhea, venereal disease. And with all of the houses of ill repute and the bawdy house and everything, obviously gonorrhea and other syphilis and other kinds of venereal disease are going to be a common affliction for doctors to treat. And self-inflicted wounds, what's that all about? These are guys that have had it. They want to go home. And the only way to go home is if you're wounded. And so they haven't been wounded by the enemy, they're going to wound themselves in the hope that it won't be that serious that it'll kill them, but it'll be serious enough that it'll be sent home and off the front once and for all. Pneumonia, obviously in the winter, and especially when you're dealing with trenches and so on and so forth, obviously pneumonia is going to be a rampant problem and disease, especially since World War I and they haven't invented penicillin yet. And then hard and soft chakras, these are the, how to put this delicately, these are the sort of growths or tumor-like things that appear on the male sex organ as a result of the venereal disease. There are few real wounded. In other words, no one's really wounded, he's saying, from contact with the enemy. All the cases he has to treat are the ones we just listed that are not a result of the war. They're a result of the different activities going on. Okay, and then he goes on a little while later, and Rinaldi says, can you lend me some money? Lend me 50 lira. So he's not only a, despicable being who just chases females for his own gratification, but he's also fond of mooching money off his friends. Loan me 50 lira. I dried my hands, took my pocketbook from the inside of my tunic hanging on the wall. Rinaldi took the note, folded it without rising from the bed, and slid it in his breeches pocket. He smiled. I must make on Miss Barclay the impression of a man of sufficient wealth. You are my great and good friend and financial protector. Tell him to go to hell, right? In other words, he wants to really impress this British nurse, Miss Barclay. So he's going to borrow money, which is probably not borrowing, it's probably never going to go back. But this way he'll be able to show her a really good time in the bar, in the tavern, or wherever. And that's part of the seduction process. Of course, what's going to happen is that Ms. Barclay is not even remotely interested in Rinaldi. But Rinaldi's friend, Frederick Henry, Lieutenant Henry, is interested in her, and is the beginning of a serious relationship between the two of them. And it causes a problem, by the way, and a breach in the friendship between these two guys, but not a total one, but enough of one that's going to have very serious consequences going forward, as you'll see. So the meeting with Catherine Barclay doesn't go well for Rinaldi, but it's the beginning of this relationship with Henry. And the relationship is sort of going to run parallel to the war that's going on outside, but which the two of them are trying to disassociate themselves with as they create this this love affair and this plan for after the war to, like I said, live in the nice house with the picket fence and have the boy and the girl and the car in the garage and whatever, which is totally illusion. And there are different ways in the story in which illusion is created, either by playing or play acting, which Catherine Rinaldi herself admits at various points, we're just putting on a whole charade, we're acting. This isn't reality. Or by getting drunk, which is another way of denying reality and putting yourself in an altered state of consciousness or whatever. So it's yet another means. But it's all an escape. It's all attempts at escape from the horrors of the war that they're both caught up in. And as we learn, Catherine Barclay actually was engaged at one point, but her fiance was killed in one of the battles early on in World War I. So she's been battle scarred that way. Plus, she's a nurse, so she's fully familiar with the horrors of war and what war inflicts on soldiers. All right, so what I'd like to do, hopefully, is on Tuesday, next time we meet, to just go through the highlights, the most important parts of the novel, and then next Thursday see the movie version, which was a major movie with Helen Hayes and Jimmy Stewart and James Stewart. It was like a major um, uh, Hollywood success at the time, and pretty good um, transfer from the novel to the movie screen. Pretty successful, and you have a real feeling for the character of and the nature of these two individuals. So that's what we're going to be doing moving forward. Then I think the next thing is the All Quiet on the Western Front, the most famous anti-war novel ever written, and then we'll see the movie version of that, which is also was pretty successful cinematographic transfer from the novel by Erich Maria Remarque onto the Hollywood screen. And then the last novel we'll look at is one that is the antithesis of the first two, but a very typical and a very representative World War I novel by Ernst Junger, who was very gung-ho on war, quite militarist. And then we'll be looking at a packet of poetry, which I'll provide you with, mostly British poets, but one very interesting German poet. And then we'll move on from there to the artwork of World War I. Any questions so far about A Farewell to Arms, about Ernest Hemingway? Please continue to read it, and hopefully we'll be able to get through it next week. And keep in mind the different images, the different symbols, and the different metaphors that I've pointed out so far, because they're just going to keep repeating. And in the ongoing drama of these two young people, Catherine Barclay and Frederick Henry, is the sort of embodiment of the relationship between them, and the war outside, and the symbolism of the deadliness of war as it relates to what's going to happen in their personal lives. So always keep that in mind. Again, any questions or comments? Okay, just one last point. The literature and the art, and I believe, I have to look, I believe the last things we did after the midterm, I think the war in the Middle East, and then of course the end of World War I, all of that will be on the final exam, which will be in the same format as the midterm. 4 out of 5 essays, 5 out of 6 IDs. And the other thing, of course, which I hope you are working on, because we're already in November, is the term paper. And the midterm, the final exam, the term paper, those basically will determine your final grade. So, any questions about that? If you ever have any questions about that, email me anytime. It doesn't have to be necessarily when we're zooming in on class. So, stay well and have a great weekend, and see you again on Tuesday morning, same time, same place. Take care.